I'm Nancy Wilhelms, and I'm the Executive Director of Anderson Ranch, and it's really great to welcome you to our first program of our 2018 Summer Series, Featured Artists and Conversations. So before I start, often I get the question of, how do you pull together a series with such excellence? How do you do that? And the answer is that we have a wonderful group. It's called the Art and Artists Advisory Group that is chaired by Sue Hostetler. And they help us with names and ideas. Then we take those names and ideas, and Ashley Toddy, our Deputy Director, who is assisted by Molly O'Leary, our Program and Events Coordinator, go to work in contacting the artists and pulling together the calendar. And then many staff and interns work to make this series possible. So I'd like to give everybody involved a hand. I'd like to say some thanks to our corporate sponsors, Douglas Elliman Real Estate, which is our premier sponsor of the summer, as well as Christie's, Cultured Magazine, and the Westin Snowmass Resort. So thank you to our sponsors. I'd also like to thank our presenting sponsor, Toby Devin Lewis, and our National Council sponsors as well. So thank you. Yes. And we have a VIP in the audience today. His name is Adam Lerner. All right. Adam is the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. So welcome back to the ranch, Adam. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. Nora Burnett Abrams is the Ellen Bruss Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. She has a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, an M.A. from Columbia University, and a B.A. from Stanford University. Her exhibition experience includes the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Gray Art Gallery of New York University. She is a 2018 Fellow of the Center for Curatorial Leadership. Our artist today, Tara Donovan, attended the School of Visual Arts at Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as the Corcoran School of Art and Design. She is known for her sculpture and installation work, and her solo exhibitions include the 2018 Armory Show, the Parrish Art Museum, Milwaukee Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, Rice University Art Gallery, UCLA Hammer Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and many others. Awards, grants, and fellowships include the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the Genius Award, and the Calder Prize. Her work is in many museum collections. Please welcome Nora Abrams and Tara Donovan. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for such a warm welcome, and thank you all so much for being here tonight, or it feels like nighttime, this afternoon, forgive me. I want to just make a special thanks to the entire staff at the ranch for organizing and hosting us so graciously, and also there are about 12 people from MCA Denver who have come up to be a part of this, and I am so thrilled to have our team here as well. We are so proud to be organizing Tara's exhibition that will open at MCA Denver in September. And in advance of that exhibition, Tara and I have been working together for about 2.5 years, and it has been an absolute honor and pleasure to get to know her and her work. And we hope that we can kind of extract from her brilliant mind as much information and detail and nuggets of kind of meaning and interpretation for you all today. So why don't we just get going?
Sounds good.
Okay. Can everybody hear us okay? Is that all working all right? Okay, great. So Tara, let's just jump in and start talking about some of the works. Just so you all know, we have the slideshow running with a presentation of Tara's work. And so it's just going to keep running as we are talking. But as you can tell, Tara, you often work with materials that are really kind of bound to everyday life, that come from our everyday life. There always seems to be a connection between the materials you use and objects that kind of narrate and motivate us in our daily life. Are you kind of, how deliberate or intentional is that on your part?
Well, originally I started working with, cheap, mass-produced materials because they were cheap and easily accessible. And I was a poor art student who, that was what was available to me. So it really began that way, but then it really proved to be very rewarding, where all of a sudden it didn't become so much, it became really about what the material could do and how I could utilize something so simple as, say, a toothpick and tease out the physical peculiarities of a specific material to kind of show what it can do. So that's kind of how it started, but it's really, it's evolved so much over time. And there's something about a drinking straw, and we all know what its intended purpose is, but a wall of 1 million drinking straws becomes something else entirely. And it becomes this kind of ephemeral atmospheric effect that you are kind of left in a suspension of disbelief. So I create all these rules for myself in the way that I work, and it kind of evolves from project to project.
What are some rules that, maybe not with that drawing, but...
originally I had a rule that I would not use any adhesive.
Oh, so you just would see how a material could bind to itself.
Right. So like an early piece was a cube of toothpicks that I made that was held together by friction and gravity alone. And then I made a lot of pieces that really just did not involve any adhesive until I finally made a piece that was made out of Elmer's glue. And then
so you threw all the rules out and restrictions out the window.
But it was only made out of Elmer's glue. And then it's the beauty of being an artist and creating rules is that you can break them.
Can you share some of the formative experiences that kind of helped you develop what has now really become your creative process, and kind of what some of the primary concerns that drive your practice today, and maybe how that might be different from when you started out?
Yeah, in the studio, I'm always kind of looking to tease out some kind of physical trait that the material can have that can kind of reveal a phenomenological experience. So I tend to kind of look towards materials that are transparent or reflective because they are heavily affected by light, where they can be kind of subdued by the light, or...
Is this like the drinking straws, or...?
Anything, the Mylar piece, I always am drawn to materials that don't have a heavy identifier, where they really are just the building block that I can then work with. I have some notes because I get nervous. Oh, okay, now I remember what I was going to talk about. Sorry, I needed that.
Okay.
So there's kind of two separate practices that I do that really converge, where there's a sculptural practice where I'm working within the framing of the architecture of a room, and then I also have this kind of 2D practice that is really constructed by the framing that is a more arbitrary decision and personal decision, where I can kind of explore variation of pattern, surface. So I think a lot about a screen, like where the kind
A screen as like a support or a screen as a surface?
a screen is a surface that has a bit of a depth that is always activated by the viewer's movement around the piece. And so the framing either being the architecture of the room where you're experiencing the piece by walking around it, or with these newer works, the composition card pieces or the pin drawings, where I can kind of explore all these variations within a framing.
kind of
So
set.
it's like the frame is the room. And so, it's kind of like the concept of a modernist painting where it's an infinite field within the framing.
And are there, as you were kind of arriving at this idea of the frame or the screen as a kind of structure almost for your work, were there any experiences along the way that helped you kind of help these ideas coalesce? Was it simply just working on these projects over a long period of time, or, are you looking at or any experiences or spaces?
I mean, my work is very process driven, so I never have an idea of what an overall composition of a piece is going to look like when I start it. It really starts with the material, and it's very much about the kind of making and doing in the studio that kind of guides the construction process. So it's very important that I'm kind of paying attention to what's going on, and that's really kind of what's guiding it. So there's obviously a lot of labor in the work, and but the process of making it's really what allows for the space to kind of conceive of what it can become. And so I've always been interested in this idea of, like the mechanized process without the luxury of a machine, where the hand is very evident. And at a point, it's when the piece is finished, when enough is enough, it almost seems as though it could generate new forms and kind of expand infinitely within the parameters of the room.
It's so funny you talk about the hand and the role of the hand, because amazingly, though a lot of hands and over a long period of time, those hands are working to make something that feels, if not so perfect, it just feels like, I'm thinking of the big sculpture that you had at the Armory show earlier this year, where everything was so perfectly laid out. It was so, it felt as though almost a machine had made it, even though it was, just a lot of people over a long period of time assembling.
Yeah. I mean, I
the
would say
tubes.
that piece particularly is probably the most kind of rigid absence of hand piece that I've ever done. In that we had a jig made, because if it wasn't all glued together perfectly, the whole thing would have gone askew. So, we had a jig kind of CNC machine cut so that we could kind of put the parts, and so that whole piece is assembled into these like building blocks, and it gets put together like a puzzle. But I feel like that piece is a bit of an exception.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you were just mentioning that, your work is so much about process, and I do think that, many people want to know. I mean, it's like the first question people ask, like how many straws were used, or how many pins were used,
Right.
and it's like the how. And I've actually always been, I don't know, to me the amassing of it is like not as exciting as like how you push the material to kind of be something else. You take something that's very sturdy and stable, and you find a way to make it fluid, organic, soft. You're able to kind of take it from its kind of given qualities and transport it to a place where it seems kind of in an opposite category. Like, to what extent do you kind of know where that, like how it's going to travel from kind of starting point to finished?
I mean, I don't.
So then what does that say in terms of, or how do you view your process then? is it just absolute faith and trust that you're going to get somewhere?
It's definitely a leap of faith, and I rely a lot on chance encounters. There's a real, you and I have talked about the sense of play. There's a real sense of play that is in the initial stages of every project that I do. Once I've sort of discovered kind of what this material can reveal, then I kind of go into more of a factory production mode, where it becomes a tedious process. I think that's, I've always used a gallery or a museum space as my studio, in the sense of a lot of these earlier large-scale installations. I've always said, like, I imagine it, I make it small in the studio and just imagine it big. And there's a lot of kind of intuitive decisions that have to happen on site. And that's always interested me, in that it's not just this static object that is specifically this or that, like the stacked cup piece, for example. It's like, I don't map out that there's like 10 cups here and 11 in this one. I just do it on site and, make it work within the architectural particulars of a given space. So there's a lot of flexibility. Even within the pieces, each time they get installed, they can really expand and contract given the given site. So with the 2D works, like the rubber band drawings or these composition card pieces that are up, they've really become more studio-based, where they're conceived in the studio, they're made in the studio, they leave as a finished artwork. And I think a lot of it kind of came out of a desire to really have more of a studio-based practice that wasn't so reliant on constantly moving around and building these things, and really getting to indulge in variation, which, in a shorter period of time.
To kind of be more, be kind of adaptive or responsive as an idea came up, to kind of execute it.
Yeah, and then it becomes almost like a puzzle that you're solving. You're like doing the exact same thing, and you can come up with all these innumerable ways of doing it, and that's what becomes really rewarding for me.
What's interesting is it seems like your approach, your process, if you will, now seems quite similar to kind of how when you were in graduate school, the kind of, you chose a program that was, at VCU that had a more emphasis on like making and doing and trying things out. And it seems like that's still kind of at the core of what you do.
It's always been at the core of what I do. I mean, I would never describe myself as a conceptual artist. I'm not that interested in inscribing my intentions into a piece. I'm much more interested in people bringing their own associations to the work, very much in the way that I do in my own studio. I think that there is... It goes back to the kind of suspension of disbelief, which is that's where my kind of discovery point in the studio is, of like recognizing some magical moment that this material can do. And I think when someone is presented with something on a massive scale that has this very ethereal quality, they're kind of forced into a suspension of disbelief, and it kind of tricks your mind to kind of believe this fictitious thing,
Absolutely.
So I think that's one of the things that I always find so difficult, because every time I start a project, it's a completely new, unique set of problems.
Is that stressful or exciting?
It is the most stressful thing in the world. Because it's literally like starting over, and I go through the whole, oh my God, I'm a fraud.
Oh, God.
Everything I've ever made is a fluke, and I'm going to get caught. That's always my fear. It's like, it's
Gig is up.
It's absurd, but it is this thing where all of a sudden it's like, all I have is my past. I can look to that, but when sort of choosing a new material, it's just, I'm completely starting over again.
I think it must be so important for the artists who are in this room, art students who are, at the ranch right now, to hear how human of a response that is. That that it's terrifying and exciting, but also, that you'd never know.
But that's what kind of what drives you to keep going, because
Absolutely.
when you actually figure it out, you're like, I'm a genius. This is the best thing I've ever done, and you pat yourself on the back. And, that's kind of, that's a huge motivator.
It's funny because you say that you're not a conceptual artist, but there is this sense of, for you, it sounds like what's the really I don't want to say meaningful, but maybe the more enjoyable aspect of your practice is the figuring stuff out. And then once you figured it out, the execution is almost perfunctory.
I feel like the labor is a bit of a reward. Mm-hmm. It becomes very meditative and really very rewarding. It's very
I'm going to remind you of this when we're installing day after day after day, realizing a tar paper
It's really
work.
fun. It's when my assistants and I, we what we call chit the chat all day long. I know so much about every little nitty gritty detail of each other's lives. And there's something very comforting as a human in that. And I don't know.
So one thing I want to address, so the title that we came up with for your exhibition is Field Work, and it's got a double meaning in a sense. So it kind of attests to this research-based, kind of laboratory-based approach almost to art making, that emphasis on experimentation, et cetera, but also attests to the dual nature of your work as both sculptural and environmental. So can you talk a little bit about how you how your work straddles both being object and installation or landscape even?
Yeah, we have to thank Nora for the title. I love the title.
Oh, I totally fed you that, so
I've always been completely interested in this idea of an expansive field. And in your essay, you talk a lot about Rosalind Krauss and axiomatic structures, and where it's kind of a non-architecture, non-landscape. And that's something that has always interested in me, and that it's, these pieces can become so big that they become these expansive fields that you're really moving within that. So, wait, where am I supposed to go?
No, but I think certainly acknowledges the kind of landscape aspect of your work, that it is both it is a field.
It's a field, and and again, one thing that, if people in this room, I'm assuming some of you have not seen any of this work in real life, there's a movement to this work. So there's a lot of these pieces, your ocular vision is at play, where you're kind of looking through something and it shadows the movement of your body. Or, it's this thick, but it's somehow transparent. And so there's just a lot at play in terms of how you move around the piece and how that landscape shifts and how it changes and how it kind of shifts back and forth between architecture and landscape and architecture and landscape. And it's just always interested me.
And are you working kind of, on the one hand, those large installations are kind of environmental, right? They're site responsive. They're the Armory Show work was 33 feet by 33 feet. So, but at the same time, I think a lot of your works on paper are also, to me, they very much signal a landscape as well, even though they're flat and maybe bound within a frame. But that difference between being a kind of self-contained object and being something far more expansive as an environment, all the work, in a sense, kind of does vibrate between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I see very little difference between like the 2D work and the 3D work. I mean, I approach it exactly the same. So whether in the 2D work, it's a work on paper where I'm utilizing like printmaking, which is a way of drawing that I really love. I years ago, I was invited by a print shop in New York to come, and my response was, I'm a sculptor. Like, I was like, he's like, I'm aware. And anyway, I went, and it was there that I was introduced to a different type of printing press that was a hydraulic printing press, which really allowed you to, print off of more sculptural materials. So, the original project I did was this unspooled adding machine paper that was kind of contained within a box and inked and printed off of. And then that really opened up a way of drawing for me. I don't make drawings, like I don't, put a pencil
even
to
for
paper.
like a big installation to kind of
Never.
sketch it out. No, that's not
No.
how you work.
Not how I work. Yeah, no, it's very much about like manipulating, figuring out some kind of building block and kind of going from there. Like with the rubber bands, it became, just like gluing these down and essentially making giant rubber stamps, and broken glass, which we're going to show a bunch of broken glass in Denver, where I inked a sheet of tempered glass, put it in put it on the bed of the press, with like a border that it could expand within that was the size of the paper, smash the glass, it it pops to its boundaries that were given to it, and then kind of tweezer off the pieces that were going to damage the press and put a piece of paper on it. There you go. So I forget where I was going with this whole
that there's not a distinction for you between
there's not a distinction, because it becomes about the framing. It just goes back to the architecture or the frame, and it's all about what kind of happens within that.
And
even like these cubes, they're made essentially by sprinkling the material into a box and then removing the box. So it's always about kind of this controlled boundary.
You make it sound like it's so easy, and it's just like, oh, you just put a box and then you like sprinkle some nails and like voila. But I think you're selling yourself a little bit short. But I would say that, or I would like to just pursue a little bit further this idea that all of, you said at the beginning, you started using cheap and accessible materials because they were cheap and accessible, but you've continued to work with them despite their being cheap and accessible.
Yeah.
Or maybe because of, but I think.
Well, they actually surprisingly become very expensive when you use as much of them.
Yeah, but you have like a cottage industry of like suppliers of all these materials, because now you know which plastic cups are the best ones to work with, and right, because they reflect the light.
Interestingly enough, like side story is just that they keep changing the way they make things like plastic cups and Scotch tape, and because what they're trying to do is use less plastic to actually manufacture these materials. So I'm in a show in Marfa, Texas called Hyper Objects right now, and I'm showing the stacked cup piece. And the cups that we got for the piece, we have all these mathematical formulas to know exactly how much we need of everything. And we were short on cups, and we were like, what's going on? And we finally realized that when 10 cups, you stack them, it's stacked this high, whereas the cups that we had used in the past, when you stack 10 cups, stacked this high.
Oh, wow.
So, it's...
So did you have to order more, or did you just kind of
No, we made it work. Marfa is essentially like an island. There was no way we were going to be able to get cups there yet.
Delivering to you there. But I just to like close the loop on this, this idea of taking things that we use all the time, but we don't think of, that they're overlooked, they're ignored, they're not given any attention to because they merely exist for us to use them in service of serving our bodies in some way.
Right.
And yet they become, what you do is you transform them to something ethereal, organic seeming. Like that opposition is something that's it's just so present, I think, when you are in the presence of your work. Is that a goal? Is that
I mean, it's a goal. I mean, I try to keep a very critical distance from any kind of symbolism within the materials and really just deal with what the material is. Like a drinking straw is nothing more than a transparent tube, and that's it.
it's a tube of a certain size that
it's a tube of a
works
certain
this way.
size, and exactly. And so I'm sorry. Can you just?
Oh, just in that that you're not trying to kind of impose necessarily, or
I'm not trying to impose anything. I mean, I'm not a provocateur in any way, shape, or form. I'm much more interested in kind of having this, the material just really transcend itself and become something else entirely, where, there's a distance from that, kind of breaks down as you walk towards the piece, and the discovery of what the actual material is kind of unfolds before you. And then you have a totally different relationship to the piece that you're looking at, because now you're like, oh my God, it's a straw. And then you back up again and you're like, wait, it's not a straw, or whatever it may be, a button.
Right. And I guess for you, I mean, I imagine that a lot of comments and feedback that you get is, how did you do this? How did it get there? How was your process? But are there, I guess I want to kind of throw it back to you. Are there questions that you want viewers to kind of be asking? Like, is there any desire on your part to kind of, I don't know, shift the conversation away from process and to something else?
You're going off script here.
Love you. Love.
I don't know. It's a hard question, because like I said, I don't really. I can't. It is a million straws. Like, I understand the desire to kind of be kind of guffawed by the sheer amount of what's in front of you and what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. And I mean, it is ultimately my motivating factor, even though, I am interested in kind of, more of an idea of, like an expansive field and what that experience is and what that means in terms of architecture and kind of the play back and forth between landscape and architecture and what all of that actually means. But I have no desire to control what other people are experiencing or the comments that they may have. Really
Liberated from that kind of.
Yeah, I'm very liberated from that.
Can you talk a little bit about, you kind of touched on it earlier, about your studio practice and maybe how it's kind of evolved from, kind of graduate school and, or just out of graduate school when you were in New York and you had your first studio there.
Yeah, I mean, my studio practice is, I'm like a pseudoscientist who's like fumbling around, kind of trying to make some kind of discovery. It's true. But so I think a lot of times people have an idea of what my studio is, and it's most definitely very different than what people actually think it is, because it's actually this like incredibly clean white space that, it's like looks like a nonprofit art gallery or something. And there's not like just tons of things around. I very much like isolate a material, kind of do all my experiments with it. It either leads to a project, or it becomes dormant and goes on a shelf, or it's been a bad enough relationship that I just completely get rid of it and never look back. So, for me, the studio is really, it's a place where I can really like experiment and play. And then I have the luxury of being able to have a few assistants where once I kind of start seeing something, I can get results very quickly, because I can be like, you, and you get over here and like, let's all do this, And then a lot of times they're like, do you want it like this? I was like, I don't know how I want it. Just do it. And let's see what it looks like. And like kind of examine it at the end of the day. And there's a lot of discoveries that come from that. And I've worked with assistants for a long time and really enjoy kind of the difference in people's hands. That, doing something as simple as ripping and stacking tar paper, you would think that it would all look the same, but everyone does it differently. It's fascinating to me how everyone does this differently, even though like you're showing them what you want them to do and they're doing it, but their area looks different than your area. And then I wind up kind of working and kind of move. It's like a constant rotation. And so I use this to my advantage to kind of have this randomness and hand be evident in a lot of it, if that makes sense.
Do you work on, like, let's say you're working with, straws and, addition paper, just because they're top of mind. Do you work on them simultaneously, or are you more kind of discrete and
I
concentrate
generally
on
work on one project at a time. The only time that there's ever really an overlap is because we're kind of remaking an older piece where it's like, it's like
It's
old.
the execution.
It's
kind
an
of
execution
happening.
thing where there's like a production thing happening and then there's a new thing happening. But when there's a new thing happening, that's the sole focus. And I mean, I'm constantly like cleaning and like rearranging my studio to kind of make the space new each time, so that
What is the benefit of it being new each time?
because it's a new space, so you're just not looking at it the same way.
You're not looking at it through the lens of
So
the
generally,
previous
like if
project.
I keep my my desk is basically a 4x8 sheet of plywood on, some legs, but like after I finish a project, I tend to move that to another room, so that then we always have kind of a clean space, and it just kind of depends how it's all what's going on, how I kind of arrange it. And
Are there, the materials that you've used up to now are pretty neutral. They're not necessarily symbolically loaded. Paper, toothpicks, glass, paper cup or plastic cups, styrofoam cups. So two-part question. One, do you have an interest in using something more symbolically loaded? And two, are there materials that you have always wanted to work with but haven't had a chance to yet?
ooh, I wish there was a bunch of materials that I've been dying to work with. It would be so much easier.
Is that one of the challenges, is finding the thing to kind of experiment with?
Yeah, I don't have a running list of things at all. Again, back to the freak out, because I finish each project. So yeah, I don't have tons of things that I kind of wish I've done, wish I could work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what was the other question?
Would you ever
Oh,
want
work with
to?
anything that's like symbolically loaded? No.
No.
Yeah.
Do you want to think
no.
about that for a second?
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, because then it really changes how you're experiencing the work.
Totally.
Where, it goes back to, me relaying some kind of message or inscribing some kind of specific idea in it. And that's just never really interested me.
It's interesting because all of, we've been speaking now for a little while, and none of your responses are about how you personally use something, right? Like the toothpick cube was the result of you removing the box, and you saw that these toothpicks adhered to each other on their own, and that kind of sparked that initial project for you. But I think it's pretty remarkable. You've had such a tremendous career thus far, and really none of the work is about or from or born of a kind of personal experience or is in a sense any kind of self-expression that you've really kind of I don't want to say inoculated yourself from that. Is that a correct assessment or no?
I think that's a very correct assessment. I'm not, I don't have an agenda that I'm trying to put forth in my work. My work is my work, and I am Tara. There's a bit of a separation. I think a lot of my motivation in all of this is always to just have that moment of discovery, and I think it's essentially the same moment that a viewer has. So,
absolutely.
I'm not. I think over time things change, and some things become somehow symbolically loaded because of evolution. But
Sure. When you start working with tar paper, you don't know that in 20 years tar paper is going to be associated with something else.
Totally. Or a drinking straw, or a plastic cup.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's funny because even though you're Tara and your work is here, you still have such a signature approach that people can walk into a museum, a group show or something, and immediately recognize it as you or as your work.
Honestly, very honest answer, I'm as fascinated by that as you. Seriously though, now there's a piece that I'll be showing that's a newish piece that for the first time in Denver that's made out of gold Mylar, and it's trolled through here. And it was remarkable through the making of this piece and kind of figuring out how to make it, that it looks exactly like these ballpoint pen drawings I did 18 years ago or something, like a very long time ago. And I think it's like anything, we are who we are.
Yes.
And if we're really true to ourselves, then, that just doesn't go away. So, I've never really been interested in illustrating theory or, having any kind of political agenda in my work. It's really about the process.
I think you're right. There's that there is that mirroring of that kind of moment of discovery that you have in the studio is just kind of writ large in for when a viewer encounters the work for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's that same kind of people have described it as wondrous, which I know is not a term that you necessarily cultivate.
It's fine.
But it is, I think, but it does capture at this very primal level that our perception or our vision is almost like playing tricks on us. And you're triggering
I think that really goes back to the idea of a suspension of disbelief and a fictitious thing. It's like the adrenaline rush that you have when you watch a horror movie. It's a similar type of an experience.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I think that we might take this moment to open it up to questions from the audience. And I have been very clearly instructed to make sure that please wait for a microphone to be handed to you from the lovely team here before you ask a question. There's somebody right up here.
I'm curious if your shapes are so organic, and you've talked about field and landscape. Are you at all influenced by nature?
So the question was, to what extent is Tara and her work influenced by the natural world, by nature?
Yeah, I mean, influence is, I am influenced by nature to some degree, but not so much in a mimicking of the way it looks. It's much more, I'm much more interested in kind of the mimicking of the ways of nature, like how something grows, like how it kind of, goes from a microorganism and kind of expands beyond that. So nature in that sense, yes. But, I'm not a particularly outdoorsy person, even though I went on a hike this morning.
It was only a hike on the way back up.
It was paid.
It was a stroll on the way down.
But of course, like I'm completely engaged with nature in many ways. But yeah. Does that answer your question?
There's another question over here.
So a lot of the materials you use are challenging to use in the bulk way that you use them because it's painstaking to cobble them all together. But specifically with the Mylar and the tape, how do you work with that when tape is sticky on one side to get that curvature and not have it stick all over? I can't even wrap a present without it getting all over my hands. So with Mylar and tape, how do you do that?
It's like knitting. Once you kind of learn how to knit, it's actually quite easy, but it's like a real struggle at first, So, yeah, I mean, originally I made that piece like literally right after September 11th, which was like a really intense time. And like I was joking with Nora where I was just in my studio all the time and like, watching television, and I really wanted a project where I could sit on the couch and kind of disappear into like reruns of Dawson's Creek. And so I started working with Scotch tape as a material because, it was transparent, it was cheap, I could get it at Staples. And it actually started as a wall-based work that then kind of evolved into these kind of units that honestly I think were really motivated by my desire to sit on a couch. I know this sounds ridiculous, but it really is very like specific to that time. It was a really difficult time. So I think it's just, like with a piece like that, it just kind of came from that. The Mylar piece is actually, I have the Mylar cut into circles in varying sizes, and then it's just rolled into a cone. So the measurement of each circle is what dictates the size of each orb based on the geometry. So when you build up the cones, it then eventually makes a ball. So that's, built in part so that it allows for kind of creating these like bubble-like structures. So in terms of like the actual physical making, that the Mylar is actually quite simple, whereas the tape piece is actually, it's difficult. It's like a difficult thing to try and show somebody how to do. I mean, I made that piece with a lot of assistance, and I don't really know. I mean, it took months, but I don't remember. I'm sorry.
I had no idea how long some of her projects take to make, and so there's this beautiful wall in our museum, and I said, oh, why don't we do a pin drawing, but like right on the wall?
I would have had to have moved to Denver 2 months ago to be able to finish that in time.
I was like, it takes like a week, right? Yeah, not so much.
No, like a pinboard takes like between 3 and 4 months.
Yeah, I had no idea. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's like 40 hours a week.
Here we have a question over here. Oh, hold on one
you
second.
need the mic?
There's going to get you a mic.
Hi. Is it working?
Yes,
Yeah.
you're great,
I
thank you.
understand you're married to an architect, and so many of your pieces have such an architectural influence. Has he influenced your work at all? Really? Interesting.
No, I make him, like, every once in a while when I need, a CAD drawing, I'm like, babe. But no, he's not really involved in my studio practice at all.
Even with all the supports or the ways to get things to connect, like you said, now you're using glue or whatever.
Yeah, no, I don't rely on any kind of computers to make my work. It's all very handmade and doesn't really rely on any of those things.
Let's see. Oh, we have a question over here.
Did we recognize right that the index card mountains were at the Renwick Gallery at some
Yes.
point? And the question is, those things must weigh quite a bit, and the Renwick Gallery is very old. Did you have floor loading questions? How do you move those
There
things?
were
and
many,
your others?
many floor loading questions. There was an engineer hired, yes. And actually, because it is such an old building, it's actually built well. So, yeah, I mean, it had to be on the first floor of the building. We obviously couldn't do it upstairs, but yeah, no, it was because it was an old building. It actually had like stone buttresses in the basement, so it could handle a heavy load. But I originally was supposed to show that piece in London, and then basically the engineer nixed it. So then I showed it in New York instead. But yes, it's really heavy, that piece.
I think we have one more question maybe over here.
You talked a little bit about like that transition between one project to another and finding doubt in yourself. Is there sort of things you do to like work through that process? And do you have any recommendations for other artists who might find doubt?
I mean, I think it's part of the process. And I guess I suppose I have some comfort in knowing that I've gotten through this before. But no, I think it's very much part of being an artist. I think the more successful you become as an artist, you still have the same problems. It's just more people are looking and judging you, which doesn't make it easier. So it's, I think that's just, it's a reality, depending on the time. I mean, I think that there's a lot of artists, very good artists, but that are, working through essentially, say, the same painting over and over and over again. And maybe they don't have that same doubt, or maybe they do, I don't really know. But mine really comes from kind of forcing myself to kind of start with a new material each time. So I don't think it's ever going to go away.
It's just about getting comfortable. Kind of
Yeah,
living
just getting
with it.
comfortable with that process of like, okay, here I go again. I'm like, in this bad head, and I've got to just work through it. But the thing is, the only way you can work through that is to show up at the studio. There's not. I'm never been an artist where like inspiration comes to me from something. It's very much about being present, working, paying attention, and being very focused on what's happening. Does that make sense?
Wonderful. Okay, well, Tara, thank you so much for sharing all of this. Thank you all so much for being here.